A house may obey its master, but a loyal creature obeys the truth. Those words had once been spoken by an old kennel keeper at Ashbourne Hall, long before Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne understood how cruelly truth could embarrass the proud. On that autumn afternoon, the south lawn of Ashbourne Hall had been arranged like a painting meant to flatter the Hawthorne name. White tents stood along the gravel drive. Silver trays flashed beneath the lanterns. The hunting guests wore velvet, wool, polished boots, and expressions of practiced delight. Beyond the hedges, the Duke's hounds waited in a straight line, their dark coats brushed, their leather collars gleaming, their breath rising faintly in the cool October air. At the center of it all stood Dowager Duchess Beatrice Hawthorne, upright as a church spire in a gown of deep violet silk, her gloved hand resting on the arm of Lady Margaret Ellison. Ashbourne requires a duchess of breeding, discipline, and grace, the Dowager announced, her voice carrying across the lawn with the calm authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. Lady Margaret possesses all three. A polite murmur moved through the guests. Lady Margaret lowered her eyes with perfect modesty, though the small smile at the corner of her mouth suggested triumph more than humility. She was beautiful in the way expensive things were beautiful, pale, polished, arranged with care. Her ivory riding dress had never known kitchen smoke, garden soil, or rainwater leaking through a servant's roof. Beside her, Duke Nathaniel Hawthorne stood in a black riding coat, tall, still, and unreadable. He did not look like a man in love. He looked like a man accepting a contract written before his heart had been consulted. At 36, Nathaniel had learned to make duty appear natural. He had inherited Ashbourne Hall, its debts of memory, its acres of old timber and rolling meadow, and the famous Hawthorne hounds that had served his family for generations. He trusted order. He trusted bloodlines. He trusted what could be trained, named, and placed in the proper room. Perhaps that was why he did not notice Emily Carter at first. She stood near the side steps with a silver tray balanced in both hands, a quiet figure in a plain gray dress and white apron, her brown hair pinned beneath a modest cap. She was 24, white-skinned, slender from work rather than fashion, with calm eyes that had learned not to ask the world for gentleness. She was one of those women great houses used every day and rarely saw. She carried tea. She carried linens. She carried the small, invisible burdens that kept noble comfort from touching its own machinery. The Dowager lifted her chin toward the hounds. Lady Margaret, perhaps you will greet them. A future mistress of Ashbourne should be known to every creature under its roof. Lady Margaret extended one gloved hand toward Bruno, the oldest and proudest of the pack, a broad-chested hound with silver along his muzzle and eyes dark as wet stone. The lawn seemed to lean closer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bruno lowered his head and gave a deep, warning growl. The sound rolled through the elegant gathering like thunder under marble. Lady Margaret froze. The other hounds stepped back, not wildly, not foolishly, but with a united certainty that made the handlers tighten their grips. A ripple of shock crossed the guests. The Dowager's face hardened. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Lady Margaret forced a laugh, thin and brittle. How strange. Perhaps they disliked my perfume. No one answered, because Bruno had stopped looking at her. His gaze had moved past silk, title, and expectation toward the side steps. Emily had just turned to leave with her tray. The old hound slipped his collar with one sudden motion and crossed the lawn. A woman gasped. A handler called his name. Emily stopped. She did not run. She did not cry out. She only lowered the tray to the nearest stone ledge and looked down as Bruno reached her. The great hound stood before her for one breath. Then he folded his legs beneath him and lay at her feet. One by one, the other hounds pulled forward, not in threat, but in recognition, until they surrounded her like a silent guard. Emily's hand trembled once at her side, then stilled. Nathaniel stared at her, as if the house itself had spoken in a language he had forgotten. The Dowager said nothing. Lady Margaret's smile disappeared, and under the fading gold of the afternoon, the woman everyone had overlooked became the only person on the lawn the hounds were willing to honor. The moment Bruno lay at Emily Carter's feet, the careful ceremony on the south lawn lost its shape. It did not collapse loudly. Nothing at Ashbourne Hall was permitted to collapse loudly. Instead, it tightened. Smiles froze in place. Fans paused halfway through their graceful movements. A silver spoon clicked once against a porcelain cup and then stopped. Emily stood surrounded by the Duke's hounds, her plain gray skirt brushing the gravel, her hands folded before her apron as if she were waiting for an instruction from the housekeeper rather than the judgment of every fine guest in the county. Bruno rested his head near the toe of her worn black shoe. His eyes were half closed, peaceful, certain, almost relieved. That certainty embarrassed everyone more than growling had. Dowager Duchess Beatrice Hawthorne descended the lawn with slow, controlled steps, her violet silk moving like a storm cloud pretending to be royal. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice soft enough to be polite and sharp enough to cut through the hush. "You appear to have confused your duties with spectacle." Emily lowered her eyes. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not call them." "Of course not," the Dowager replied. "Creatures are often drawn to familiar scents. Kitchen scraps, kennel straw, the rougher corners of service. Nothing mysterious in that." A few guests smiled carefully, grateful for permission to treat the impossible as vulgar. Lady Margaret's color returned by degrees. She lifted her chin and gave Emily a look so smooth it almost passed for indifference. "How fortunate that Miss Carter is useful somewhere," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried. Emily felt them land. Not on her skin, not in her ears, but somewhere older, where years of being overlooked had settled like dust in an unused room. She had been called useful all her life, never treasured. Useful hands, useful silence, useful feet that could cross a hall without being heard. She did not answer. She had learned that a servant who defended herself gave the powerful a second pleasure, the chance to call her insolent. Duke Nathaniel watched from beside the empty place where Lady Margaret had been meant to stand triumphant. He should have intervened. Some distant part of him knew it. The scene had become unkind, and he had been raised to believe a gentleman's duty was to make unkindness unnecessary in his presence. Yet the old habits of station held him still. Emily belonged to the working passages of Ashbourne, and Lady Margaret belonged to the future his mother had arranged. To protect one might insult the other. To question his mother before guests might fracture the obedience on which his house had long depended. So he said nothing. But silence did not feel clean in his mouth. He saw Emily's fingers tremble once against the edge of her apron. Only once. Then she stilled them. The restraint struck him more forcefully than tears would have. There was no pleading in her face. No performance of injury. She stood inside humiliation as if holding a candle against wind, small but unextinguished. Bruno shifted and pressed his muzzle more firmly against her shoe. The hounds behind him settled lower, forming a living border between Emily and the people who wished her return to invisibility. The Dowager noticed, and her eyes hardened. "Take the animals away," she ordered the handlers. The men tugged gently at the leads. The hounds did not move. One young handler flushed with panic. "Your Grace, they are not obeying." The words made the guests murmur again. Lady Margaret stepped back half an inch, as if obedience itself had become contagious, and she did not wish to catch its failure. Emily looked down at Bruno. Her voice, when it came, was barely louder than the grass stirring near the hedges. "Bruno." The old hound lifted his head. "Go with Thomas now." She did not command. She requested. Bruno rose at once and turned toward the nearest handler. One by one, the others followed, calm and orderly, as though no resistance had ever occurred. The lawn fell into a deeper silence. Nathaniel felt something in his chest tighten. The Dowager's face remained composed, but her hand closed around the handle of her fan until the ivory creaked. Emily bent to retrieve the silver tray from the stone ledge. "Return to the kitchen," the Dowager said, "and remain where your work is useful." Emily curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." She walked away across the edge of the lawn, not quickly enough to suggest shame, not slowly enough to suggest defiance. Nathaniel's gaze followed her despite himself. He noticed the worn seam at her cuff, the careful way she held the tray to keep it from rattling, the small streak of hound hair against her apron where Bruno had leaned. Beside him, Lady Margaret laughed lightly, too late and too bright. What a strange little disturbance. Nathaniel looked toward the kennels, where Bruno now stood watching the kitchen path. "Yes," he said, though his voice had changed. Strange. For the first time that afternoon, he wondered whether the disturbance had been caused by the servant leaving the lawn, or by everyone else pretending not to see what had happened. 3 weeks before the south lawn fell silent under the judgment of the hounds, Emily Carter had found Bruno in the rain. It was not the sort of rain that came politely, tapping windows and silvering garden paths for the pleasure of poets. It came hard from the northern hills, sweeping across Ashbourne's pastures in gray sheets, flooding the lower road and bending the willow branches until they brushed the ground like grieving hands. Emily had been returning from the kitchen garden with a basket of herbs tucked beneath her shawl when she heard the sound near the south stone wall. Not a howl, not a bark. Something lower, rougher, and more frightened than angry. She stopped beneath the dripping branches and listened. Another servant might have hurried on. Bruno was known throughout the estate as the Duke's sternest hound, too proud for petting, too old for foolishness, and too loyal to tolerate careless handling. Even the younger kennel boys gave him space. But Emily had never believed that fear made a creature cruel. Fear only made the world too close. She set down her basket and followed the sound along the wall, mud pulling at the hems of her skirt. By the time she found him, the daylight had nearly gone. Bruno stood half-tangled near a broken stretch of fencing where a fallen branch had trapped his lead beneath a stone. He was not badly harmed, but he was wet, cold, and alarmed enough to bare his teeth at the first sight of her. Emily stopped several feet away. She did not gasp. She did not scold. She lowered herself slowly onto the wet grass, careless of the mud soaking through her apron, and kept her eyes soft. "Easy, old soldier," she whispered. Bruno growled, but the sound lacked certainty. Rain streamed over his dark head and silvered muzzle. His body trembled with exhaustion he was too proud to admit. Emily stayed where she was, speaking now and then, not to command him, but to keep loneliness from winning. She told him the rain would pass. She told him the kitchen fire was still warm. She told him that no creature should have to be brave every minute of its life. Nearly an hour passed before Bruno lowered his head. Only then did Emily move closer, inch by careful inch, until her fingers reached the trapped lead. She worked the leather free with patience, then tore a clean strip from the inside hem of her apron to wrap the small scrape above his paw. Bruno watched her hands. He did not snap. When she finished, she did not try to claim his gratitude. She simply stood, picked up her basket, and walked with him through the rain toward the kennels before anyone could notice he had been missing. At the door, he paused and looked back once. Emily pressed one finger to her lips, smiling faintly through the wet strands of hair clinging to her cheek. "No need to tell them," she said. "Pride is safer when it has a witness who keeps quiet." Bruno entered the kennel. Emily returned to the servants' wing with a ruined apron, muddy shoes, and a chill that stayed in her bones until morning. No one thanked her because no one knew. That was how most of her kindness lived, unseen, unpaid, and unrecorded, like roots beneath winter soil. Yet Bruno had known. And on the afternoon when Lady Margaret extended her perfect gloved hand and expected loyalty to behave like inheritance, Bruno remembered the rain, the patient voice, the torn apron, and the girl who had never once treated his fear as ugliness. Down in the kitchen after the lawn incident, Emily stood at the long wooden table rinsing cups while the other servants whispered around her. She said nothing. Outside, beyond the steamed window, Bruno sat near the kennel gate facing the servants' path. Duke Nathaniel saw him from the terrace above and followed the hound's gaze to that narrow door where Emily had disappeared. A strange unease settled over him. His mother had called it kitchen scent. Lady Margaret had called it disturbance. But Nathaniel had lived with hounds all his life. They did not kneel for scraps. They knelt for trust. By late afternoon, the south lawn had been remade into a stage for recovery. The silver trays had been cleared, the chairs rearranged, and the guests gathered closer to the kennels, eager for a demonstration that would make the earlier embarrassment seem no more than a servant's accident and an animal's mood. Dowager Duchess Beatrice stood beneath a dark green awning with her fan open, every line of her posture announcing that order had returned because she had commanded it to return. Lady Margaret Ellison stood beside her in a cream riding dress trimmed with pale blue ribbon, her gloved hands folded, her smile restored with careful effort. She looked composed enough to be painted. Only her eyes betrayed irritation, bright and cold whenever they drifted toward the kitchen path. Emily Carter had been ordered to remain nearby with a tray of freshwater glasses, not because anyone needed water, but because humiliation often liked its witnesses close. She stood at the edge of the lawn, half in shadow, feeling the weight of every stolen glance. The other servants kept their distance, uncertain whether pity would insult her or kindness would endanger them. Bruno waited with the hounds near the low iron gate, his broad head lifted, his gaze fixed not on Lady Margaret, not on the Dowager, not even on the Duke, but on Emily. Duke Nathaniel noticed. He wished he had not. Since the incident, his mind had returned again and again to the same impossible question. What had the old hound recognized that the rest of Ashbourne had refused to see? Lady Margaret stepped forward, accepting the leather lead from the head handler. "I believe," she said lightly, "that a future mistress of this house should not be judged by one unfortunate moment." The guests murmured agreement, relieved to be offered a script. Nathaniel stood a few paces away, his expression reserved. "The hounds do not perform for vanity," he said. His mother turned her head. "They obey the family." The sentence landed like a warning. Lady Margaret's smile sharpened. "Then they shall obey me soon enough." She turned to Bruno and extended the lead. For a moment, the lawn held its breath. Bruno looked at the leather in her hand, then at her face, then away. A faint ripple moved through the guests. Lady Margaret's fingers tightened. "Come," she said, still smiling. Bruno did not move. The younger hounds shifted behind him, restless but not unruly, as if waiting for the old one to decide whether this woman deserved the path before them. Lady Margaret gave the lead a small pull, not hard enough to be called harsh, but enough to reveal impatience beneath polish. Bruno's ears flattened slightly. Emily felt it like a hand closing around her own heart. She lowered the tray onto a side table before the glasses could betray her trembling. Nathaniel saw that too. His gaze moved from Emily's hand to Bruno's posture, then to Lady Margaret's flawless smile. Something in the arrangement of the scene began to trouble him, not loudly, but insistently. Lady Margaret tried again, her voice lower. "Heel." Bruno remained still. The Dowager's fan snapped shut. Perhaps Miss Carter should step farther away. The animal is distracted. Emily took one step back. Bruno immediately turned his head after her. The entire pack leaned in the same direction. The guests saw it. There was no hiding it now. Lady Margaret flushed. "This is absurd," she said softly, though the softness made the words colder. She pulled the lead once more. Bruno planted his feet. The handler moved forward, embarrassed, but Nathaniel lifted one hand and stopped him. "No," the Duke said. The single word quieted the lawn. He looked at Lady Margaret. "Release the lead." Her eyes widened. "Your Grace." "Release it." For the first time all day, the Duke's voice did not sound like a man preserving appearances. It sounded like a man listening. Lady Margaret let the leather fall. Bruno did not rush to Emily. He simply stood free, dignified and immovable, as though refusing to turn loyalty into theater. Emily looked down, trying to disappear into the shadow of the awning, but the attempt failed. Nathaniel's eyes found her again. In that instant, she was no longer merely the servant his mother wanted removed from view. She was the quiet answer to a question his house had asked in front of everyone. The Dowager stepped closer to her son. "Nathaniel, you are allowing a household girl to disrupt an important day." He did not look away from the hounds. "No, mother," he said slowly. "I think the day was disrupted before she ever entered it." Lady Margaret's smile vanished completely. Beyond the lawn, the first veil of evening mist began to gather along the southern garden wall, soft and pale among the hedges. No one noticed the small figure of Lily Hawthorne chasing a white butterfly past the open gate. No one noticed except Bruno, whose head lifted suddenly toward the fading light. Bruno's head lifted before any human voice called Lily's name. The old hound stood so suddenly that the leather lead at his feet dragged over the grass with a soft hiss. His ears pointed toward the southern garden wall, where mist had begun to gather between the hedges like pale smoke. Emily saw the change in him at once. It was not restlessness. It was recognition sharpened into alarm. Her gaze followed his, past the awning, past the guests who were still murmuring over Lady Margaret's failed demonstration, toward the small iron gate that should have been latched. It stood open. A white ribbon lay on the path just beyond it, fluttering faintly in the cooling air. Emily knew the ribbon. It had been tied beneath the chin of Lily Hawthorne's little straw hat when the child had run laughing across the lawn earlier, too small to understand how quickly evening could turn a grand estate into a maze. "Where is Lady Lily?" Emily asked. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with the force of fear kept under discipline. The dowager turned sharply. "She is with her nurse." The nurse, standing near the refreshment table, went white. "She was, Your Grace. Only a moment ago." The lawn changed then. All its polish vanished. Guests began looking behind chairs, beneath awnings, toward the terrace steps, as if a child could be recovered by searching only the places that felt proper. The dowager's fan slipped from her hand. Lady Margaret pressed her gloved fingers to her mouth, frozen between concern and the terror of being expected to act. Nathaniel moved first among the nobles, his face losing every trace of ceremony. "Close the front drive. Search the garden paths. No one leaves the grounds until she is found." His commands were clear, but the mist was already thickening beyond the southern gate, and everyone at Ashbourne knew how the old paths divided near the creek bed. Emily set down the water tray. No one ordered her. No one looked at her. That was why she was able to move before permission could stop her. She crossed to Bruno and bent near his head. "Easy, old soldier," she whispered. The words struck Nathaniel like a bell heard through fog. Bruno stepped forward immediately, not dragging, not lunging, but guiding. The other hounds rose behind him, quiet and focused. Emily gathered her skirt with one hand and moved toward the open gate. "Miss Carter," Nathaniel called, following. "You cannot go into the south gardens alone." She did not turn back. "Then do not let me go alone, Your Grace." The answer was simple, practical, without insolence, and it carried more courage than any speech made that afternoon. Nathaniel took a lantern from a footman and joined her at the gate. Behind them, Lady Margaret remained beneath the awning, her cream dress untouched by grass or mist, her face pale with indecision. The dowager looked from her chosen bride to the servant disappearing into the fog and understood, with growing dread, that the difference between them had become visible to everyone. Emily stepped through the gate with Bruno at her side. The southern garden swallowed sound quickly. Gravel gave way to damp earth. Boxwood hedges rose taller than a child's head. The air smelled of wet leaves, cold stone, and the faint sweetness of late roses closing for the night. Bruno lowered his nose to the path where the white ribbon had fallen, then moved left toward the older orchard walk. Emily followed without pulling him, trusting the language of his body. Nathaniel watched her from half a step behind, lantern light catching the worn hem of her dress, the mud already gathering on her shoes, the steady line of her shoulders. She did not look like a woman intruding into danger for admiration. She looked like someone doing what needed to be done because a frightened child mattered more than being seen. They passed the old sundial, the broken fountain, the yew arch where mist clung in silver beads. Twice Nathaniel began to speak. Twice he stopped. Bruno knew where he was going. So did Emily, though she had never been invited to walk these gardens as a guest. Servants knew houses differently. They knew the back paths, the loosened stones, the shortcuts children favored when escaping nurses and rules. At the edge of the orchard, Bruno paused and gave one low bark, not threatening, but certain. From beyond the hedges came a small, trembling voice. "Uncle Nathaniel?" The Duke's breath caught. Emily was already moving, lifting her skirt over the wet grass, following Bruno toward the sound. In the hollow near the dry creek, beneath a curtain of tangled vines, Lily Hawthorne sat with her knees drawn close, her straw hat missing, her cheeks damp with tears and mist. She was frightened, chilled, but unharmed. Emily lowered herself slowly, careful not to startle her. "There you are, little one," she said softly. "The whole garden has been looking for you." Lily stared at her, then at Bruno, and began to cry with relief. Emily removed her own shawl and wrapped it around the child's shoulders. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, lantern in hand, watching the woman his mother had dismissed bring peace to the one person every title on the lawn had failed to protect. In that quiet hollow, with mist beating on her hair and the hounds gathered around her like guardians, Emily Carter stopped being invisible to him forever. The return through the southern garden was slower than the search had been. Fear, once relieved, left behind a delicate silence, and even the hounds seemed to understand that the child in Emily's arms needed gentleness more than speed. Lily Hawthorne clung to Emily's shawl with both small hands, her face tucked against the plain gray fabric as if it were the safest thing in all of Ashbourne. Emily carried her only a short distance before Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice low. "Allow me." Lily reached for him at once, and the Duke took his niece with a tenderness that startled Emily more than his authority ever had. He settled the child against his chest, one arm secure around her, the lantern hanging from his other hand. For a moment, the cold and distant master of Ashbourne Hall vanished, and in his place stood a man who had nearly lost something precious and had no pride left to hide his gratitude. "Were you frightened?" he asked Lily. The little girl nodded into his coat. "I followed the butterfly." Then the garden went gray. Emily walked beside them, Bruno close at her knee, the rest of the hounds moving in a quiet arc around the path. "The mist can make familiar places feel strange," she said gently. But Bruno knew where to look. Lily lifted her head. "Bruno found me because Miss Emily asked him." Nathaniel looked at Emily then, not as one looks at a servant who has performed a useful task, but as one looks at a person whose courage has altered the room inside his mind. And how did Miss Emily know what to ask? The question was soft, but it opened the story she had kept hidden. Emily lowered her eyes to the damp path. "I found him once near the south wall, in a storm. His lead was caught. He was tired and afraid." Bruno's ears shifted at the memory. Nathaniel stopped walking. The lantern light trembled across his face. "Why was I not told? It did not seem my place to tell anyone, Your Grace. You saved my oldest hound, and thought it was not your place to mention it." There was no anger in his voice, only disbelief touched by shame. Emily looked toward the hedges where the first stars had begun to appear above the mist. "People in my position learn the difference between doing good and being believed for it." The words were not bitter. That made them worse. Nathaniel had no answer. They resumed walking, and the gravel of the main garden path appeared beneath their feet. Ahead, the lawn glowed with lanterns and worried faces. The dowager stood at the gate, rigid with fear she had not permitted herself to display. Lady Margaret remained near the awning, her dress still flawless, her gloves still pale, her expression arranged into concern that had arrived too late. When the guests saw Lily alive and unharmed, relief swept through them in whispers, then grateful exclamations. The nurse cried openly. The dowager hurried forward and reached for the child, but Lily stayed in Nathaniel's arms and pointed back at Emily. "She found me," the girl said. "And Bruno." Every eye turned. Emily stopped at the edge of the lantern light, suddenly aware of the mud on her hem, the wet strands of hair loosened from her cap, the empty space where her shawl now wrapped the child. She made no attempt to explain herself. The hounds did it for her. Bruno moved first, crossing the gravel to stand at her side. Then the others followed, forming the same silent guard they had made before. Only this time no one laughed, and no one called it kitchen scent. Nathaniel set Lily gently into the nurse's arms and turned toward his mother. "Miss Carter went into the mist without hesitation," he said. The hounds obeyed her because she had already earned their trust. The dowager's mouth tightened. "A fortunate accident." "No," Nathaniel said, and the word carried farther than any shout could have. "A pattern." Lady Margaret looked away, but not quickly enough. Bruno noticed. So did Nathaniel. So did Emily, though she wished she had not. Something hidden beneath the afternoon's humiliation began to stir, like a curtain moving before a locked window. The Duke looked from the hounds to Lady Margaret's perfect gloves, then back to Emily's ruined shawl around Lily's shoulders. The difference between display and devotion stood before him with painful clarity. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Hawthorne understood that Ashbourne Hall had not been embarrassed by a servant. It had been exposed by one. Lady Margaret Ellison had spent her life learning how to survive a room by controlling what it saw. A softened smile could hide impatience. A lowered gaze could imitate modesty. A gloved hand could conceal the tightening of fingers. But no lesson had prepared her for the humiliation of standing beneath Ashbourne lanterns while a kitchen girl, damp from the mist and marked with mud, received the kind of silence usually reserved for saints and dying kings. The guests looked at Emily Carter differently now. Not warmly yet, not freely, because pride releases its judgments slowly. But they looked. That was enough to unsettle everything. Lily had been taken inside by her nurse, wrapped still in Emily's shawl, and the Dowager Duchess had ordered hot tea, blankets, and composure for everyone, as if composure could be poured from a silver pot. The hounds remained near Emily, Bruno seated at her left side with the grave authority of an old soldier who had chosen his post. Duke Nathaniel stood a few steps away, his face unreadable, though his eyes had changed. They no longer passed over Emily as part of the household machinery. They rested on her with attention, and Lady Margaret hated that attention more than the hound's refusal. "Surely," she said, her voice bright enough to sting, "we should not make too much of a servant wandering after a child. Miss Carter knows the back paths. That is all." Nathaniel turned toward her. "Knowing the path is different from entering it when others hesitated." A faint murmur moved through the guests. Lady Margaret's smile thinned. "I did not hesitate from indifference, Your Grace. I hesitated because rushing blindly into mist helps no one." Emily lowered her eyes, wishing the ground would open a quiet door and return her to the kitchen. She had not gone after Lily to be praised. Praise from the great could be as dangerous as scorn. Both placed a servant where she could be examined. Then a young kennel boy named Thomas stepped forward from near the gate, twisting his cap in both hands. He was barely 15, pale with fear, and clearly regretting courage before it had fully left his mouth. "Your Grace," he said. Nathaniel looked at him. "Speak." Thomas swallowed. It was not the first time Bruno refused Lady Margaret. The lawn grew still again. Lady Margaret's head turned slowly. "Be careful, boy." The warning was velvet wrapped around stone. Thomas trembled, but Bruno rose beside Emily and gave one low sound, not threatening, only steady, as if lending the child the courage humans had denied him. "During the fitting last week," Thomas continued, "Bruno came through the side yard with me. He brushed against Lady Margaret's gown. Only a little. There was mud from the rain." Lady Margaret's face became perfectly blank. The dowager stepped forward. "This is hardly relevant." Nathaniel did not move. "Finish." Thomas drew a breath. "Her ladyship was angry. She told me the hound should be taught not to soil what was above him. She ordered me to lock him away without supper." A soft shock passed through the gathering. It was not the severity of the act alone that disturbed them, but the sentence, so neatly formed, so carelessly revealing. What was above him? Emily felt the words settle over herself as much as Bruno. Lady Margaret laughed once, delicate and false. A kennel boy misunderstood a moment of frustration. "I would never concern myself with the feeding of dogs." "No," Emily said softly. The word surprised even her. Every face turned. She lifted her eyes, not to challenge Lady Margaret, but to stand beside the truth Thomas had risked telling. "You would not concern yourself with whether they were hungry, only whether they obeyed." The silence that followed was deeper than insult. It was recognition. Nathaniel looked at Emily, and something like sorrow moved across his face. The dowager opened her mouth, then closed it. Lady Margaret's beauty remained, but its polish no longer softened what lived beneath it. Bruno crossed the space between Emily and Lady Margaret, then stopped in the center of the lawn, placing himself between the woman who had shown kindness in secret and the woman who had treated loyalty as decoration. The other hounds followed, not growling now, not restless, simply certain. Nathaniel's voice was quiet when he spoke. "The hounds did not shame us today. They warned us." Lady Margaret stared at him. "You would take the word of a boy and a servant over mine." Nathaniel looked toward Emily's ruined shawl as Lily's nurse carried it past the terrace door, then toward Bruno standing firm in the lantern light. "I would take the evidence of every frightened thing that found peace near her and fear near you." No one on the lawn had an answer for that. Above Ashbourne Hall, the first stars appeared, cold and clear, while the truth settled among the guests with the weight of something that had been waiting all afternoon to be named. The Dowager Duchess Beatrice Hawthorne had built her life upon the belief that dignity was a wall, and that if a family stacked enough names, rules, marriages, and silences upon it, nothing common could ever climb over. But that evening, beneath the lanterns of Ashbourne Hall, she saw the wall begin to crack because a servant had carried a child through mist and a hound had remembered kindness better than people remembered rank. "This has gone far enough," the dowager said. Her voice did not rise, yet it struck the lawn with the force of a command polished by decades. "Lady Margaret is tired. The child is safe. The hounds have been unsettled by weather, confusion, and too much attention. We shall not turn a private family arrangement into theater for the county." Lady Margaret seized the offered rescue like a handrail. She drew herself taller, gathering the remains of her composure around her cream skirts. "Your Grace is generous," she said to the dowager, then looked toward Nathaniel with wounded elegance. "I had hoped to serve this house with devotion. I see now how easily devotion may be mistaken when servants are encouraged beyond their station." Emily felt the sentence pass over her like a cold draft from an open cellar door. Beyond their station. It was always there, beneath every softer word. The invisible fence. The warning bell. The place where people like her were expected to stop, even when a lost child, a frightened animal, or simple truth waited on the other side. She stood very still, her hands folded before her apron, Bruno beside her, the other hounds settled in a crescent at her feet. She would not beg to be understood. She had not begged Bruno in the rain. She had not begged Lily in the mist. She would not beg a lawn full of silk and judgment now. Nathaniel turned slowly toward his mother. "Is that what you believe happened?" The dowager's eyes flashed. "I believe you are allowing sentiment to endanger the future of this family." "No," he said. "I am allowing evidence to endanger a lie." The words changed the air. Even Lady Margaret seemed to forget how to breathe for a moment. Nathaniel stepped into the center of the lantern light, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that made anger unnecessary. A woman chosen for Ashbourne should bring peace to the household, not fear disguised as discipline. She should not treat servants as furniture, children as ornaments, or loyal creatures as decorations meant to obey whatever hand wears the finest glove. Lady Margaret's cheeks flushed. "You insult me before guests. You insulted this house before its hounds," Nathaniel replied. They were simply honest enough to object. A faint sound moved through the crowd, quickly swallowed. The dowager stared at her son as if seeing a stranger wearing his face. "Nathaniel." "Mother." His voice softened, and somehow that made it firmer. "I have honored your judgment for years because I mistook obedience for gratitude. But Ashbourne Hall is mine to steward, and I will not begin its future by ignoring the only truth that has stood steady all afternoon." He looked at Emily then. She wished he had not. Not because his gaze was cruel, but because it was not. It held apology, recognition, and something quieter that she did not know how to trust. "Miss Carter did not ask to be placed in this matter," he said. "She did not seek praise. She did not expose Lady Margaret to gain favor. She acted when others hesitated, and the hounds trusted her because she had earned what no title can purchase." Thomas the kennel boy lowered his head, relief trembling through him. Bruno settled fully onto the grass at Emily's feet, not as a spectacle now, but as a seal upon the statement. Lady Margaret looked from the Duke to the hounds, then to the faces of guests who had begun to withdraw their sympathy with the quiet cowardice of society protecting itself. "And what do you intend?" she asked. Nathaniel faced her with grave courtesy. "The understanding between our families is ended." The dowager drew in a sharp breath. Lady Margaret went pale, then still. No one spoke. Somewhere near the terrace, Lily's small voice called for Emily from an upstairs window, and the sound drifted down over the lawn like an answer no adult had been brave enough to give. Emily's composure nearly broke then, but she held it. Nathaniel removed the hawthorn kennel key from the chain at his waist, an old brass key worn smooth by generations of use. He walked toward Emily and stopped at a respectful distance. He did not place it in her hand without permission. He held it out and waited. "If you are willing," he said, "Ashbourne's hounds will answer to the person they already trust." Emily looked at the key, then at Bruno, then at the Duke. Around her, the world that had overlooked her stood watching. She lifted her hand and accepted the key. Morning found Ashbourne Hall quieter than it had been in years. The guests who had slept beneath its roof spoke softly over breakfast, not because anyone had commanded silence, but because the previous evening had left too much truth in the walls. Lady Margaret Ellison departed before 10 o'clock with her trunks packed in flawless order and her face hidden behind a traveling veil. The Dowager Duchess did not come down to see her off. She remained in the east sitting room, where the curtains were half drawn and the fire burned low, confronting the difficult dignity of being wrong. By the kennels, the world had changed in smaller, truer ways. Emily Carter stood before the iron gate with the brass key resting in her palm, its weight unfamiliar, its promise heavier than metal. She still wore her plain gray dress, though Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, had insisted on replacing the ruined apron and bringing her a dry shawl. The other servants watched from a careful distance, uncertain how to address a woman who had been sent to the kitchen at noon and entrusted with the Hounds before nightfall. Bruno solved the matter by walking to Emily's side and sitting there as if nothing at all were confusing. The younger hounds followed his example, tails still, eyes bright, waiting. Emily opened the gate. It swung inward with a long, low sound, not of grand triumph, but of old hinges accepting a new hand. "Come along, then," she said softly. The hounds entered one by one, calm beneath her voice. Nathaniel watched from beside the stone path, his black coat buttoned against the morning chill, his expression less guarded than before. He had not slept much. Some men are kept awake by regret because it wounds their pride. Nathaniel had been kept awake because regret had finally become useful. It had shown him where he had failed to look. When Emily finished settling the hounds, he approached only as far as the open gate. "Miss Carter," he said. She turned, one hand still on Bruno's head. "Your Grace." The title sounded different now. Not colder, more honest. He held out a folded paper sealed with the Hawthorne mark. "Your new position will be recorded properly. Keeper of the Hawthorne Hounds and steward of the South Garden Paths. Full wages, private rooms near the kennels, and authority over every handler assigned here." Emily looked at the paper, then at him. "That is more than I expected. It is less than I owe." The words were simple, and because he did not decorate them, she believed he meant them. Still, she did not reach for the paper at once. "I do not want to become another ornament your household points to when it wishes to feel generous." Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly, accepting the rebuke. "Then do not let us make you one." He looked back at her. "Correct us when we try." A faint breath of surprise escaped her, almost a laugh, but too fragile to be called one. Bruno pressed his head beneath her hand, reminding her of the rain, the mud, the hour when kindness had asked for no witness and found one anyway. Emily took the paper. From the terrace above, Lily Hawthorne came running with her nurse close behind, her hair tied with a fresh ribbon and Emily's clean shawl folded in her arms. "Miss Emily," she called. "Bruno is waiting for his walk." Emily bent slightly as the child reached her. "Then we must not keep him disappointed." Lily placed the shawl carefully over Emily's arm. "I wanted to give it back." Emily touched the fabric, remembering the mist. "Thank you, little one." Lily glanced at Nathaniel. "Uncle says you know the garden better than anyone." "Your uncle is learning many things," Emily said, and Nathaniel, to his own astonishment, smiled. It was not the polished smile of a duke at a formal table. It was quiet, unpracticed, and gone almost as soon as it appeared, but Emily saw it. The dowager appeared at the upper terrace just then, dressed in black silk, her posture still proud though her face seemed older in the morning light. For a long moment, she looked down at Emily, at Lily holding her hand, at Bruno standing at her feet, and at Nathaniel waiting not above them, but beside them. No apology crossed the distance. Not yet. But the dowager inclined her head, small and stiff, and for a woman like Beatrice Hawthorne, it was the first stone removed from a wall. Emily returned the nod with calm respect, neither grateful nor triumphant. She had not been raised to mistake crumbs for justice. The hounds moved toward the south path, and Lily skipped beside them, safe and laughing under the pale sun. Nathaniel walked a few steps behind Emily, close enough to follow, far enough not to claim. There would be no sudden declaration, no hasty promise dressed as romance. What had begun the night before was quieter than that, and stronger for being quiet. Trust, like a frightened creature, came only when it was not chased. At the garden gate, Bruno paused and looked back at the house, then forward to Emily. She understood him. Some places did not become gentle all at once. Some hearts did not learn humility in a single evening. But a door had opened, and this time, the one who had been overlooked held the key. Some souls are chosen not by blood, or title, or the approval of those who mistake pride for worth. Some souls are chosen by the peace they bring to every frightened thing.